Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk. These talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the building and live online. Hello, if you're watching us online. So whether you're in Bristol or you're far away, you can join in the conversation. My name is Martin O'Leary. I'm the studio community lead here. I'm a white man in my 40s with long hair and a beard, wearing some fetching light blue shorts and a black t-shirt today. Every Friday, we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend some time in our space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So an especially big welcome to anyone who's new to the studio. Can anyone who's new to the studio put your hand up? Okay, quite a few. Hi, folks. This bit is for you. What is the Pervasive Media Studio? We're a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology, everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. And we're a partnership between Watershed, where we are right now, UWE Bristol and the University of Bristol, and we're funded by Arts Council England. What we do is we offer studio space, including desks, meeting rooms, events and opportunities, all for free to our residents as part of a spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. And most of all, we're a space for people to take risks with embryonic ideas and to make some time for collaboration. So just a few notes before we begin. Please do feel free to move around, make a cup of tea, grab a glass of water from the kitchen. It is quite warm in here today. We've got the fan running, or I've got the fan running up here at the front. The rest of you can bake. But there is water in the kitchen back there. If you're getting a bit hot, feel free to grab some. We have a quiet space just next to this space, so to my left, to your right. Anyone who needs to take a break at any point, there's some sofas and beanbags in there. Also quite a good air conditioning system. So if you're starting to overheat, that might be a good spot to be. And there are fire exits at either end of the studio. And if you hear a fire alarm, we're not expecting a fire drill today, so it's probably real. So the studio team will direct you towards the fire exits, but they are at the other end of the studio on either end. And then there are accessible toilets, including baby change, in the corridor over there next to the kitchen. There'll be a Q&A at the end of this talk. So if you're watching online, please pop your questions into the YouTube chat. Lawatim is here to be your voice in the room today. If you're in the building, stick your hand up and we'll send around a microphone the old-fashioned way so that the folks can hear what you're saying. You can get news on all of our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at Pervasive Media Studio at mastodon.social on Mastodon, at pmstudiouk.bsky.social on Blue Sky, or at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. We're not posting on Twitter/X anymore, so if you're following us on there, attempting to get information, you will fail. Find another way to get your information. So today's talk is part of Home, which is a year of making, experiencing, and sharing ideas of home. Throughout 2025, Watershed is hosting a program of films, immersive art, talks, and workshops that will explore the many different ways in which people find, make, imagine, long for, and escape home. And you can find more about that whole program at watershed.co.uk/home. Anyway, that's enough of that. Our speaker for today is Simon Moreton. Simon is... Hey, okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Simon is an artist, writer, studio resident, and also, although it's not relevant today, Associate Professor of Creative Economies at UWE Bristol. Simon's experimental memoir, Where, documents the unexpected links between landscape, grief, and childhood that appeared in the aftermath of his father's death in 2017. And today, he's going to reflect on the book and the processes of grief and reflection that helped him tackle questions of belonging and home, as well as thinking critically about how we imagine and represent the countryside. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Simon.
Well, thank you, everybody. I wasn't expecting 2 rounds of applause, so hopefully maybe I can manage a 3rd one at the end, but let's wait and see on that. Start my stopwatch. So my name is Simon. I am a white man with ambiguously coloured shorts and t-shirt on of the pale variety. I have holes in my shoes, odd socks. My beard is quite trim. It's ginger. It's trim, given it normally looks like fighting red squirrels. And I have the face of a 42-year-old man whose 8-month-old daughter kept him up all night. So please excuse me if I drift off at any point, although I've had enough coffee, so it should be all right. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, the studio, for having me. I've been a resident since 2012, and I joined as a research fellow at UWE, and most of my work in my capacity here is kind of research stuff around the creative sector. How do we make the arts a more fair and equitable place to be? That kind of stuff. alongside that, I've always had an artist practice as well, and so this is quite a nice opportunity for me to kind of share some of those aspects of my life, really. Sort of content warning. I mean, I'm going to talk about, mostly talking about landscape and memory and home and things like that, but I will be referring to issues around cancer, sudden death, and that kind of stuff as well. And there might be a mention of baby loss and miscarriage as well, so just to kind of prepare you for those things. So, as an artist, most of my practice is kind of in the kind of DIY art space. So I make zines, which you can sort of understand as essentially homemade pamphlets of some kind or another. Here's just a selection of some that I've made over the years. I think last count I either published myself and with stuff that other people have published, released over 50 things since about 2008. So some of those things are little, just folded up pieces of paper. Some of those things are big books like the one I'm talking about today. And really, the root of the way that I work is the idea that by taking them into production for yourself, you can circumnavigate lots of the different kinds of power structures and imbalances that exist in the kind of publishing and arts world and find a community of other like-minded people who do the same. It comes from a long tradition of self-publishing. That word sometimes gets associated now with things like print on demand and other forms of models that kind of come out of the sort of DIY literary kind of world, but this is kind of more rooted in the kind of punk rock kind of feminist alternative kind of spaces. These days, my work is sort of mixtures of poetry and prose. It looks in things like this. If you want to know what a little zine looks like, this is a recent one that I made. I tend to make these at home on my printer, but not always. And here's another one. So just sort of little pamphlets, black and white mostly, that kind of thing. In terms of what's in them, I tend to reflect on my life. I tend to kind of think about how our everyday lives connect to bigger and broader themes, life, death, place, you know, all those little ones. And I've always been interested in a mixture of text and image. So these are slightly grainy pictures, but these are aspects from other pieces of my work. So I'm really interested in the way that text and images of all kinds kind of mix together. What happens when you do that? How does that affect the story that you want to tell, the way that story kind of evolves and comes out and that kind of stuff. I actually started out making comics. So from comics, I've kind of evolved back into prose, poetry, something in between, something weird. I'm not entirely sure. But I also studied as a geographer when I was at university, and I've always been very interested in local history and place and things like that. So when I came to write the book which I'm talking about today, which is Where, which I'll hold up my little prop. There we go. There's the book. When I came to make this, which is kind of about three different things, really, kind of interwoven. One is about my father's diagnosis and his illness and the aftermath of his death, which has happened in a very short space of time. Diagnosis to death was about 6 weeks. So it was a very kind of rapid kind of traumatic event in the family history. It's also about thinking back to where I grew up, which is in the South Shropshire countryside, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And it was also about returning to that place, having moved away 30 years ago from that place, to kind of think about what it meant to be, to kind of be returning to thinking about it, to processing grief through my re-engagement with that kind of landscape as well. And the book actually started life as a series of zines, which you can see here, which I made on my printer at home. I've got a very big stapler. I kind of hand-folded all of these bits and pieces and the flaps and stuff, and it was released in sort of 4 installments, which if anyone's interested afterwards, they can flick through. I made, I think, about 100 copies of each of these kinds of things. I think I broke my printer. I got through so much toner. I probably have a terrible carbon footprint for that particular thing. I'll talk more about some of that kind of practice stuff towards the end. But really, it was a labour of love, and it was a kind of a labour of kind of... I think I read a review somewhere that said that this project shouldn't work, but it does by sheer force of will, which I'll take. But I think I wanted to will it into being, and the kind of the process of doing was a big part of the process of coming to understand grief, life, death, my own place, and that kind of stuff. And crucially for this talk, ideas of home. So here's a picture of my dad and my mum on top of a hill called Titterstone Clee Hill, which is in South Shropshire. And this kind of image was one that kind of had sort of floated around our family for a very long time. So when So we had like a modestly peripatetic existence as kids. So my dad was a radar engineer. Basically meant he tended to work on these radar sites around the country that mapped aerospace. So you know when you see air traffic controllers and the thing goes boop, and then there's a little plane. Basically, the data for those comes from these radar sites all over the country, and they have like a sort of a patchwork things. And so I was born in Dover, but then I lived in Surrey, moved to Shropshire when I was 4, left Shropshire for the home counties when I was 11. Then I lived in Devon, Cornwall, Cardiff, and I came here about 20 years ago. So I've always sort of been moving around a little bit. My dad came from a sort of modestly sized working class family in Maidstone. So he has sort of roots in Kent, whilst my mum was born in Lancashire, but she's from Yorkshire, but she grew up in Kent as well via Essex. So there's a sense of kind of, home has always been a sense of wherever we've been, because that rootedness, that kind of located rootedness within our kind of like, let's say, family tradition or like generations has never really been something we've lived near. So in terms of where, so the book is called Where because people would say, oh, where are you from? And then I'd give them that spiel, and then their eyes would glaze over. And then eventually say, I guess I'm from Shropshire though. And then I'd tell them where, and they'd go, where? Because they don't really know. So here's a map. As a geographer, love a map. Over here we have the town of Ludlow, which some of you may know. It has a castle, it has a festival. It was very foodie for a while after we left, I should add, because clearly they didn't think we should have nice food. I lived here in Caneham, which is a little village about 3 miles outside. We had a village school that I attended in the end and a phone box, and that was about it. And here is this thing called Caneham Court, which is a big old stately home, Georgian, but goes back a long way, and that was our houses. All our houses were built in an estate around the kind of broken up landscape of that manor house. And that manor house is still there now, and obviously explored it a lot as a kid, and I'll be talking about it a bit more here. Then up here is Tidston Clee Hill, which is a big, tall, 1,750 feet above sea level. Yes, that's the one, there we go. And that's kind of thing. So another way of looking at this, because you know this is all different ways of representing a landscape, a map. This is the kind of photo you often get when you think about Ludlow. And this is a picture of Ludlow in the foreground, various nice Georgian and medieval buildings, the castle wall, St Lawrence's Church. Caneham is somewhere over here, just behind this foreground bit, sort of back here, and then this is Tidston Clee Hill. And it's got a big, kind of fairly recognisable profile. Looks a little bit like a wave about to break. And we moved into this kind of new build house in 1987. You can just see one of the wings of Caneham Court behind us. And so mostly my landscape was woods, trees, barren landscapes where the builders had been, the old walled gardens of the abandoned mansion, a few new build houses, and not much else really. This is our kitchen. I really like this picture. I found it kind of, you know, one in the family, and kind of it's a representation of a particular moment in home. And actually, I kind of feel very linked to this particular photo. I really love this little bowl, this fruit bowl that my parents have still got with the old black and white TV that we used to kind of tune in every morning to try and get Nicholas Witchell on the BBC Breakfast News. House plants, I remember. So it just kind of sums up particular kinds of aspects of my being. And in many ways, it was a fairly idyllic childhood. I want to read a little bit from the book. I know, I'm not sure whether book readings are anything we ever do in lunchtime talks, so hopefully you'll kind of, you won't mind if I do this, but it's just to kind of give you a sense of the way in which, for me, growing up in the countryside, gave me a particular kind of sense of place and rootedness, but a kind of ambiguous one that wasn't necessarily separated easily between the ideas of nature, human, you know, countryside, urban, or anything like that. So it was living here that I fell in love with the natural world. Everything was connected, wild, confusing, terrifying, comforting. I didn't think of what people did as being separate from what the birds and the beasts did. Homes popped out of the ground like shrubs. People planted fences in the same way the maroon docks seeded themselves in piles of builder's waste. The earth birthed blue and white crockery pieces while berries grew on barbed wire and television aerials throbbed with incoming cartoon energy. I came to know, without even realising it, the smell of thousands of years of stratifying rolling earth, of sheep wool and cow shit, and clay soil and rotting leaves and the bright voltage of water. I watched the purple plumage damsons ripen in the hedge opposite our house, plump like wrens. They hung by a gap in the foliage that dropped to a wonky plank of wood, pitched over a squelch of a ditch. I'd walk to the village school over that improvised bridge, up the small bank on the other side, over the fence and into the school field. I learned to swim, but couldn't put my head under the water. I learned what a horse sounded like when it farted, and how not to be scared of cows. So the idea is that I was kind of starting in the book to process this sense of kind of a fairly, like I say, idyllic kind of belonging. And because, I should have mentioned this, the book itself is half text, half image, I was trying to find different ways to represent that sense of a kind of a feeling or a memory of a place rather than actually kind of representation in the kind of a drawing. So there's me in some woods. Here's me and my brother. God, this screen is like so high resolution. It's really showing up on my grainy pictures, isn't it? I'm going to have to like up my game next time. And this is my brother and I exploring the river and the woods that were kind of just behind our house. And Clee Hill featured very heavily in our life. This is one of Dad's radars, as we used to call them. There's a little spinning radar in there, and that's just basically a great big dome. And if you go inside there, it's kind of like a cathedral. I write about it in the book, but it's kind of like a weird cathedral of like hexagons and panels and all that kind of stuff. I also wanted to try and collect stories about the hill. So I wrote about driving up to the peak and kind of walking around in the book, like walks that I took as a kid, walks that I took trying to process my dad's grief and a return to the place. This particular one is from a story that my dad's colleague told me about one of their colleagues who used to drive to work. Now, it's a single track beset by sheep and holes that goes all the way up. It goes about a mile along with no passing places up to the summit. And he used to eat his cereal as he was driving. And one day, he turned up, he was late for work, and he eventually turned up with a dented roof and cornflakes all over the ceiling of his car. And what happened is he had pitched off, rolled over, and just by chance, some heavy machinery going up to the radar station was passing, picked him up, put him back on the road, and he finished his journey. So I wanted to kind of capture some of these kinds of everyday stories as well in that kind of, in the way that I wrote. Kind of almost like a memorial for my dad as well, and for these kind of weird lives that were existing on top of this kind of fairly barren and remote place as Titterston Clee is. But I was also interested in the way that the history of the place was or was not represented, because it's kind of a well-known place in some respects. If you're from that area, you know it by sight. But historically, it was also very isolated. The communities on the top of the hill, until really the post-war eras, had very little transport infrastructure going back down the hill. The roads were crap. During the winter, they would be snowed in for months at a time sometimes. So you had a very kind of strong working class identity on the top of the hill, and a kind of sort of disconnection from, so this is Ludlow, kind of like sort of 5 miles away. So this kind of quite isolated kind of thing. And those stories aren't kind of well known. So I sort of also wanted to start, as I was going back and processing my grief, capture some of those and record those. So there's all sorts of stories in the book about old farms that they turned into healing well bathing baths for the poor. There's stuff about sheep that go eat sandwiches, and all sorts of kind of, quite sad and tragic things that occurred throughout history as well on that hill. I'm trying to kind of salvage some stories. This is an old mill. It's now a mill. There's now a little cafe. But when I was in Ludlow, that was where I learned to swim, because there was a swimming baths there. But they demolished that, which is probably good. It probably should have demolished when I was swimming there in the late 80s. It also has a kind of esoteric kind of connection, the hill itself, as well. So this is from, come on, sleepy brain, ley lines. Alfred Watkins. This is from one of his books about leys. You know, ley lines, this idea that there are straight tracks in the prehistoric landscape. These days, they often get kind of associated with kind of stories on like earth energies and vibrations and that kind of stuff. But originally, when Alfred was talking about those in the 20s, it was a much more of a kind of archaeological thing, like the shortest space is from A to B. And so you would find these markers in the landscape. And he thought that Titterston Clee was a primary sighting peak, i.e. that like ley lines would use that as a sighting peak. So if you're walking in a straight line, you can always see the hilltop and that kind of stuff. So there's all these kind of wrapped up histories. One of the strong histories was of the mining, quarrying communities that lived on top of the hill. So there had been mining there since medieval times, and if you walk across the landscape, you can still see the remains of those things. There's a thing called bell pits, which is where they used to basically just dig a shaft down, throw all the stuff around the outside, so it looked like a bit of a donut, and then they leave them behind. They backfill them. They just look like little ring donuts, and those are kind of bell-shaped, is what they get the name from. I think they look a bit like donuts. So anyway, and then this goes on all the way through into the Industrial Revolution. Quarrying intensifies over mining once the coal seams were exhausted. And it's kind of a continuing usage. And the other continuing usage on the hill is, I think, about this idea of like looking out. So there were Bronze Age burials on the peak. There's an Iron Age hill fort around the perimeter of the peak as well, in a dry stone wall rather than earth mound. And then in the middle of that, there's the radar station. So you've kind of got thousands of years of continually human occupation, but kind of always up there and over there. The other thing that happened during this period was loads of people came from all over the country to work on the hill in the kind of like the latter half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. And a dialect formed on the hill that people in town couldn't understand. So it was kind of like really like remote in that kind of sense. And this man is called Dennis Crowther, and he was a Clee Hill man who was an entertainer and stuff like that. So this is on the BFI free film player, but I just want to play you a little bit because he talks a bit in the dialect, and you can just get a sense of the kind of the language and the sound of the place. Hopefully.
Well, it's gardening time in the country, the soil must come to terms. The spores I'm waiting up in the spout for me to disturb the worms. I hadn't long been digging when someone suddenly made me laugh. Ha ha! When I finished big garden last season, oh, the blooming hell borrowed me cap. Well, follow me dog, me did Monday, follow me righty.
I was actually going to like skip to a different bit, but you've got a song now as well, so there you go.
Hang about, Dennis, it sounds lovely, but
What's up with me?
what's it mean?
Well, it's the local dialect about here. That's how they talk up here.
I'm a stranger from Wellington, you know. How do they talk up here?
Well, it's based on the bisna, the shasna, the cosna, the utsna,
Do what's on
yod,
the shop?
shudders, and fit.
How did it all come about? Because it's a different dialect, isn't it, up here?
It is. Well, in the depression, all the people come from all over the country, different dialects.
What, to work in the quarries?
Yes, that is so. To find work in the quarries.
You've worked there yourself, haven't you?
Oh, of course, yes, I have, yes.
You've had a few jobs.
Oh, 23 at the last count.
So that's just a little snapshot of it. And actually, I don't think there might be one person left. There's a guy called Alf Jenkins, who's a local historian, who still speaks the dialect. It's essentially now a dead language or a dead dialect in that sense. And for me, one of the kind of the things that I found kind of grounding when I was doing this this kind of research, this writing, this thing that I was doing in the years after my dad's death, was senses of like continuity and disruption and change. So one of the things that to me most represents that sense of communities kind of hanging around and disappearing or whatever was this thing which is called the three-forked pole. And at one point where 5 ancient parishes meet on the top of Titterston Hill, there is the three-forked pole. And there's been a pole here going back at least until the 17th century, but possibly even further. And what happens is it periodically falls down. The local community re-erects one. They choose it quite carefully. How it started as being a three forks, we don't know, but it could be a kind of Christian kind of cross kind of representation. This one went up in the 70s. The previous one went up in the 1920s. And then you kind of sort of can trace it back like that. So this sense of there being something that is both permanent and impermanent, the same but different, is kind of like the, I'm going to forget his name now, I want to say Heraclitus, the guy who sort of like, you never step in the same river twice. So the river stays the same, but also it changes because the water is always moving, and you also are the same in that you stay the same, but you also always change because you're not the same person stepping in the river the first time or the second time. And that kind of sense of trying to become comfortable with the ambiguity of place and time and who I was and what was happening was kind of a really big part of writing the book. Another thing, though, that I was incredibly conscious of was, and I mentioned this earlier about this kind of like idyllic childhood kind of thing, because it was idyllic, but also it was a very rurally deprived area. I was very badly bullied at school before I moved to the village school. There was a lot of social and cultural issues because it was a very kind of forgotten community for many, many years. And I think that was only exacerbated by the kind of the food stuff that happened from '94 onwards as well. And And if you spend too much time, hanging around in the past, this is an old Russian proverb. It might be slightly apocryphal. I'm not entirely sure. I think the first half was recorded sometime in the 19th century. The second half might have been made up. But I like it. Dwell on the past and you lose an eye. This idea that you have some kind of, there is a price to pay for always looking backwards and not paying attention to the contemporary, but also forget the past and you lose both. So this sense of vision and possibility for understanding yourself was very important to me. So if I could understand, where I was in time and in place, and other people's stories too, there might be some kind of grounding kind of thing for that. And there's a part of the book which is sort of, which kind of deals with that as well. This idea that it lists all these different kind of events and associations of the Hill, both humorous and otherwise. And then a sense of, well, why does it matter? Why does my story matter in the kind of the landscape? Any of these other stories that are happening, these forgotten stories, these stories that belong to other people, and that kind of stuff. It's also deeply rooted in the really problematic concept of the rural idyll, which is something that Corinne Fowler has recently been writing really well about in terms of how a kind of a rose-tinted version or vision of the kind of the way in which the natural world and the natural order of things happen around the agrarian, the agricultural, in fact masks the reality of the working poor, how it removes non-white lives and black lives from those histories, how it removes colonialism and all that kind of stuff. And the rural idyll is often an easy way to say, here we go, they're picking the mangel wurzels, and they're kind of happily nestled in their kind of, in their landscape here. You can sort of see trees and then haystacks and then buildings. They all kind of look as if they're all of the landscape as well. And it's all part of the natural order of things. Here's the kind of merrily at work doing what they do. And I chose this picture when I found it because that hill in the background looks a bit like Clee Hill. Don't know if it is, but just look that way. So the idea is that these kinds of things hide all these power imbalances as well, because these will not necessarily be farmers who own their own land. These will be tenant farmers potentially. Some person with wealth and possibly wealth accumulated through enslavement and other kinds of parts of the kind of colonial trade would be able to kind of reassure the natural position of themselves as the masters by displaying artworks like this that show the happy urban folk, the rural folks doffing their caps and living in there. And you see this kind of stuff in, this is from a 1940s guidebook, the Countryside Handbook, I think it's called, with just this chap looking out over a thing saying, oh, son of the soil, he's of the soil, he's of the earth, he's all these kinds of things. When actually, they're people who lived incredibly difficult kind of lives. So there was some sense of reclamation that I was trying to do as well, because although, and so thinking about the contrasts in my own life, my dad and half of my mum's family were very working class, but we weren't raised in that way, so we were kind of middle class, but not super, and then we were, and then we weren't, and and all these kinds of class ambiguities, and I've often heard it talked about that only the middle class have class ambiguity. But there are these kind of questions about belonging and identity that kind of came out of that, and that sense of kind of rootedness too. And part of the book is trying to make sense of the fact that my stories matter, but that doesn't mean that they're more important than anybody else's, that to share the story needs to be done in companionship with trying to understand others, because you get solace from that, as well as kind of sort of a bit of justice. And this is two pictures from the book. And in Canham Court, so in this big old mansion house I mentioned, when my brother and I used to play around the outside of it, there was you could still see through the windows, and you could see this big bookshelf in there. And so we were like, one day we're going to go in there and find out what's in that bookshelf. And we found a way in one day through the old cellars, and then up, and we got to the bookshelves, and we discovered that they weren't real. They were actually wood. It was like a wood facade, and it was a hidden door. They kind of went, we thought it was like a secret tunnel, but it was probably just the way in which the serving staff came in and out of the library. And somebody's recently bought the building. The building changed hands a lot and nothing ever really happened to it. And there's now a antique gun restorer and hunting enthusiast who owns the building. And I swallowed my better judgment and went and had a visit. And I went into his kitchen, and surprisingly, the only thing, the original kind of stuff that was remaining in the kitchen was 3 panels of the fake bookshelf and one with the door handle in it just there. So I was like, oh my God, I didn't make up, because I thought I'd made up this memory. My brother doesn't really remember it. He's older than me, but he doesn't really remember it. And so there I was in this kitchen of somebody whose politics I didn't represent, who was trying to bring back this mansion into a kind of old school landed gentry kind of thing. And on the wall, there were these 3 panels that reminded me of this kind of version of history that I had kind of encountered as a kid. And the best thing about them is that the titles, which you can't see in this image, was historical plays. So the whole thing was like, oh my God, this is like a, you know, a kind of ambiguous sense of like, we're just telling these stories and reinventing and that kind of stuff. But at the bottom of the end of the day, really, or the bottom of the line, end of the day, the coffee's wearing off, the sleep deprivation is catching up. At the end of the day, like, my experiences were also real in the sense that they were lived. So this sense of home that I was trying to kind of crave, it was very telling that we as a family, and my brother, my mum and I, after my dad died, kind of talked a lot about our time in that place. It was sort of the period of our family history when we were all together, because by the time we moved away from there, we were becoming teenagers and doing other kinds of things. And my dad commuted a long way to Heathrow and then Gatwick. The kind of fabric of our lives was changing, but in that period, it was very comfortable, happy time. And I remember when we were discussing where we would like to spread my dad's ashes. And I think my mum and my brother had a conversation already. It was like a test. So where do you think we should? And I was like, Clee Hill? And they're like, yeah. And so that's what we did, because we kind of, that place, even without conversation, this is before I started writing this book, even before that sense of this place being emblematic in our lives, this kind of, in some respects, kind of an invented sense of home, an invented sense of kind of place and rootedness was there. And this is actually the spot where we ended up scattering his ashes, kind of looking out across the landscape. And I mean, it's high enough that sometimes when you go up there, you're above the cloud level, so there's just cloud, and you can't see anything below. And then sometimes you get these beautiful kind of things like that, the views like that. And I want to read another quick bit, if that's all right. Thank you for indulging me. I'm really new to reading things out loud, like doing book readings and stuff. So this is like in keeping with the studio's experimental, mindset. No technology other than the technology of the book. I say that, but of course I didn't actually put a bookmark in this particular piece that I wanted to read, did we? So yes, I'll keep talking while I try and find that. So the book itself is a continuing kind of like reckoning of kind of all different kinds of histories, all different kinds of places. There are stories about antiquarians who go like wandering on the hillside trying to work out why it's called Clee Hill, and then kind of unpicking kind of the homophobic cultural, social, scandal that he was involved in that kind of shaped his life and shaped the way that he kind of came up with his ideas, all that kind of stuff. And I realized when I was writing stuff like this that these are the ways in which I was making this place home, that I was instantiating it as home, even if perhaps it maybe was a little bit of an invented concept for me. So this is about spreading my dad's ashes. So the next morning I drove the 1,749 feet up Tidstone Clee Hill, gaining ground past the quarrymen's cottages and out onto the thin road to the summit, navigating the cattle grids and the sheep, passing the old quarry scars and overgrown railway embankments, the spectre of a car covered in cornflakes. I parked in a puddle under an exposed rock face. We changed our shoes and I took the bag from the boot and locked the car. It was 30 years since we moved to Canaan, 22 since we left, and 162 years, almost to the day, since the Woolhope Club walkers hiked across the same hill on which we now walked. And the Woolhope Club were an amateur geological society founded in Herefordshire who wrote about visiting the hill, and their description is kind of part of the way I unpicked the way the hill is represented in history. We made our way past the radars and up to the highest point. We found a spot that somehow felt right. I opened the bag and poured out the contents. And there we sat with Dad. Dad as ashes, Dad as a silent guest, transmuted back to the stuff of the universe amongst the moss and rocks and lichen and bilberries and roaming sheep. We chatted idly. It was one of those days on Tidstone, the clear sunny ones. Bright as fish scales in the sun, only a hint of a haze at the edge of our view. All the landmarks the Walhopians described were visible, all the field systems and streams, the crannies and the nooks, the gentle rise and fall of the lowlands, all the twinkling windows of the farms and the vague shape of Ludlow, all the August sky and all the August land. No dog days here, no sultry death of crop bereft of heat-exhausted birds. A wide, open panorama, little hedgerows and mackerel slippery streams and brooks coursing the wiggly way around us. Mum picked at the ground, a bit of sheep wool, a bilberry, and dropped it down the little crevice where Dad sat. Votive offerings. I thought about saying goodbye to him in the hospice while I added some grass, a bit of moss. We sat with Dad for a long time. I got a bit sunburned. It was so peaceful and so strange. It was a bit like being stuck between two frames of film, not wanting the reel to turn and take us on to the rest of the story. Eventually, though, we had to say our goodbyes and leave so that Dad could quietly rejoin the world as something new and so that we could too. And what I realised was that for me, home is a process. It's an ongoing kind of process of understanding the relationship between a kind of sense of physical place, emotional place, landscape, all those kinds of things. And it's quite hard to articulate. And many of the themes in the book are about that, but not directly. They're about grief, there's things about masculinity, there's all kinds of stuff. But it's also about trying to find my place in the world. And I realise that those kinds of processes aren't ever really over. And I know this is particularly true for all kinds of people whose life experience has been very, very different from mine. And so it's kind of, a kind of a sense of never completedness. And I think about that a lot. I've been in Bristol for nearly 20 years, which is as long as I've ever lived anywhere. I have the aforementioned baby/constant alarm clock. And so a sense of kind of how many different lives you can live in one place, even in 20 years I've been in Bristol, and a sense of the location and the kind of roots that you attempt to create and the things that challenge those processes as well, and all of the kind of other things in this very horrific and challenging point in history that intersect with those processes, and how it's really important, I feel, to do for that sense of groundedness, but it's also incredibly challenging to do because of such a complex historical relationship with the places that we live, the things that we do, the things that mean, the things that mean and matter to us. So, yeah, the book came out in 2021. Here's a recent drive up to Clee Hill. You can see it kind of up at the summit. And I am going back there. So I made the zines 2018, 2019, 2020. The book came out in 2021, and I'm actually going back there in September for a year's worth of, well, not a year's worth of walking. Over the course of a year, I'm going to visit Clee Hill a couple more times, do some more walking, do some more writing, and kind of revisit the place and kind of come up with some kind of like sequel reflection. And what I really want to do in that is try and reconnect the small scale to the much more contemporary, bigger kind of scale of what's happening as well, and really reflect on where I've come in the last 4 years since the book was published, but 8 since my dad passed, fatherhood, place, the state of the world, and all those kinds of things that we live in now. And so that's me. Hopefully that's been a kind of interesting whistle-stop tour through some things. I hope it's given you enough sense of the book. It was quite hard to kind of work out how to tell you about what is, we could call it dense and multifaceted rather than like stuffed and wordy, but there's lots of stuff in there, and I wanted to try and tease some of those things out. So I hope that, I hope that was an interesting kind of thing. I have copies of the book if anybody wants to buy one. They're 20 quid, I can take card. And yeah, but I'm really happy just to talk about it a little bit more as well if anyone's got questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Does anyone have any questions for Simon? Somebody. I'm going to stare at you all until someone does. There we go. Wow, sorry, can I?
Hey, thank you.
It is on. It's not.
222. Is it? It's just okay. Cool. Sweet. So I'm curious to know, on the journey that you went on to create the book, what was something you discovered about yourself that you didn't expect to learn?
Ooh, that's an incredibly good question. But I've always kind of like felt the ethos or the spirit of the work that I've made over the years in the zines, the stuff that I do is like to make honest work, so work that's honest and true to my experience of the world as best as I can at that moment in time. And I think I learned some quite practical stuff. Like I was capable of making something big, something bigger than I thought I could, something that could pull together all those kinds of themes. I was kind of like, as a physical or practical achievement, it was quite surprising that I could do that. But I think on an emotional level, it was a sense that like, the thing that really reconnected me to was my family. And I think that being a small family, and we weren't a particularly effusive family growing up, we didn't necessarily say we loved each other all the time, all that kind of stuff, but we were always quite raised to be quite independent. But there was the strength and importance of family as like a core sense of who I was, even though I was kind of looking for these roots, looking for these links outwards and discovering that actually quite a lot of it was already kind of there, as well as kind of invented family as well, the family that you produce for yourself through the friends and the people that you meet. So my wife and I got married about a month after my dad died because we were just like, well, we've been through this and this is just what we want to do. So we ran away and we got married. So it's those kinds of senses, I think, of the importance of, I guess, the home that you find in the people around you, even if it's not a geographical thing. So probably that was what surprised me the most.
Any other questions from the room?
Did you draw any universal conclusions about what home is from your work? You mentioned home is a process. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that's got universal application?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, I think for me, I am somebody for whom most things are a constant process. I think we all are. We're always kind of like, we're always in a state of being, becoming, not working out what's next. So for me, it was kind of an extension of that, and hence saying kind of home as a process. I think, if anything, it's about the kind of, we joked about this, we have joked about this working here over the years, but actually it's like the sense of living in a constant state of contradiction, the way in which we have to live in ways that you have to kind of almost hold different truths about your life, about your own story, but about other people's true at once. Like I had a privileged upbringing. There's loads of stuff that wasn't privileged about it. I had a wonderful experience when my dad died. Some people have it worse, some people have it better. That's on a very personal level, but also politically much broader. All of the kind of intersections, that we have to live with. So I think that for me, it was about. I don't think I could say that it's a universal conclusion that I could lay any kind of claim to making, because I think people have been talking about this for an incredibly long time. But for me, it's that living in a constant state of contradiction. I realise that even more so now with becoming a father. Like, I have this kind of like mini paradise of my little family of 3 people, but we live in a world that's full of like homophobia, transphobia, genocide, and the gaslighting of the world around us that tells us, no, this is the truth. And you go, well, I know that this is the truth, but this is also a truth, and this is a truth. So for me, I hope the book can kind of come in some way to kind of contributing to that kind of discourse about continuing to live in those states of contradiction and finding and feeling okay with the moments of peace and challenge and acceptance that you can. And I think maybe that's probably true not just of that book, but also the work that's kind of followed on since some of it anyway. But yeah. Whether that's a kind of a universal finding or not, I don't know, because obviously we were having incredibly different lived experiences, but I think there might be things that are in common anyway.
Any other questions?
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering, how does Bristol fit into your concept of home now? And you mentioned a bit about having your own child, and has that changed since you've had your own child?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. That's kind of one that I'm kind of been thinking through a little bit. So in end of 2019, we bought our first house. I love this, bought our first house, if we have a whole plethora of houses. We bought a house for the first time in Fish Ponds, and then and that was December, then the pandemic struck, and then so we're near Eastville Park. And so for a period of time, I was able to just go exploring the River Froome, the park, all that bit around there, a kind of sort of urban, rural, kind of countryside nature kind of moment. become very rooted. And it was that moment, I think, that started to change my relationship with Bristol. I suddenly felt like I was creating my own kind of roots and that kind of stuff. That place was incredibly important as well. So I've written another book, which I self-published, which is called Now is the Time to Know Everything, which kind of deals with my wife and I experience of baby loss. So we had kind of a major miscarriage a couple of years, 3 years ago now. And again, that was sort of about that was more about knowledge and like, how does it feel you can't learn yourself out of a crisis, out of a trauma. And again, the sense of place for me was quite important in that stuff. And now, again, we moved out of our house for like 8 weeks while they were doing some building work, and now we've just got back yesterday and walking around going, oh my God, I'm so glad to be back. So I'm really sensing that like not just the family stuff, but the kind of a like geographically located sense of that as well. So it's also given me a rootedness to be able to think about some of the different kind of ways of life that I've had and documented like in my zines and stuff in Bristol for 20 years. Like I moved here when I was 23, and you live a lot of different lives when you run up to that kind of stuff. So I'm not quite sure what the answer is yet, but I definitely sense there's a continuing process of working that out. But I do feel like, yeah, it's home now. And especially that sense of trying to create a home for someone else as well, like really sensing that this is where my daughter is coming to be for the first time, and these are the kind of places that she will be engaged with and that kind of stuff. So, yeah. So I think to answer your question in a very long and wordy way, not sure yet, but I'll find out.
Actually, mine was a really similar question, with an inflection of whether whether home feels like a sort of zero-sum game to you. You know, do you lose a bit of home where you are by exploring so intently a home somewhere else? But I think you've probably answered it. So unless there's anything else you want to say, my other observation is just that there was loads of technology in your talk, Simon. There's loads in the book. There's printers and there's ploughs and there's mills and there's radars and there's ley lines. So just responding to that comment that there isn't technology in there, I think it might be an interesting avenue to explore.
Definitely. And I think, so to the first point, I think, I don't think it's zero-sum game because it also, sorry, I'm hitting my microphone. Sorry if that goes weird, online people, if there are any of you. No, I think it just kind of, it's that for me, that constant process of interrogation. Maybe you take your attention away from one bit for a while, but I don't think that necessarily depletes a sense of home. I think you're capable of, I feel now I have this toolkit, or this way of this way of understanding, this way of engaging with these questions. It's just all part of the process of getting to know yourself and your place. So I don't think so. I think it enriches it, for me anyway. Yes, and that's that technology question. So that's something that I do talk about in the book. Thank you. Joe's read it, which is very kind of her.
It's a really great book. I really recommend buying it.
But not a plant. Yeah, no, that sense of technology is something that's really, really interesting me, because one of the reasons that we moved away from Shropshire was because the old radar stations used to sort of be, they were staffed 24 hours a day. And if something broke, my dad would often be on call. They'd have to drive up the hill and then go and fix it, like very manually, very kind of like soldering. I don't know. I'm cunningly not an electrical engineer, don't really know how to fix a radar, but it was very kind of hands-on. And as time progressed and technology developed, those processes became more and more remote and automated. So now I don't know whether the station, which is still there, is even staffed, except for the occasional visit and do that kind of stuff. So my dad moved into kind of management because essentially the closing down of that form of technology, and that is something that happens with the mining. It's something that happens with the quarrying. The quarrying is still ongoing, but what's really interesting about the quarrying is that although it's kind of leaves all of it, the kind of undulating shapes and sounds, the quarry escapes, the cliffs and all those kinds of things are there. There's still a big quarry there, but they wanted it and they put it together. They built it in they established it in the 70s, and they wanted it much, much bigger. But what I didn't mention actually was that most of Titterton Clee's summit is common land, so it's not, so people can do, it is common to the people. And there was a kind of a movement, like the Commoners Association basically really pushed back this idea of having like open cast quarrying and mining, whatever. And one of the ways that they were able to kind of demonstrate that the common land had continual usage as well as the kind of like the grazing sheep and that kind of stuff was a three-forked pole. By having that stake in tradition that kind of went back a long way, they were able to say, hey, we still use this space. And they're able to kind of limit that. So it's a different form of limiting of technology, not just technological development, but also a kind of technology of people pushing back on those kinds of things. So yeah, that's actually a theme that I am kind of really interested in revisiting, because from the Bronze Age cairns that are up there, there's Neolithic axe heads and stuff been found around there as well, all the way through to and another fun fact, and just while I'm off on one, is that some of the rock from Titterton Clee, which is very, very hard, Cardiff docks were paved with it, it's called Dewstone. A lot of the kind of the prehistoric peoples around the burial urns of various different kinds of communities around the hill were actually made using clay, but they included big lumps of rock from Clee Hill. So up the top there, and they brought them down, they put them in there, and they kind of made them into the fabric. So the sense of the materiality of the hill also rolls out as well. So the fact that it was the kind of the metaling as in road metal thing, road surfacing material of choice for about 50 years probably. So Cardiff docks originally were done. There's various different places where the stone is. So, and actually a lot of the families who lived on the hill as those industries receded also went abroad as well. So there's one of the family names on the hill is Bytheway, which is by the way. Bide a while, by the way, but Bytheway. And there are Bytheways in America who became like sort of industrial magnates out there who kind of took those skills and took those places, you know. So there's also a story about a guy called Teddy Bytheway in there as well. But so there's all these senses in which the hill broadcasts as well as is seen. And I'm really interested in that kind of like looking out, looking up kind of tension. And that may be something that I can explore now. Now I'm not hanging it off the event of my dad's death, because that was obviously the lens that I was coming to this through. And now I kind of have an opportunity to kind of take a different kind of thing. Having established that, for one, it is part of my home, it is part of who I am, it is in me, and so maybe I can go back with a different lens.
Jack first.
Thank you, Simon. Absolutely love that. And as I've told you before, like it's such a privilege to be able to hear people talk about their relationships with place, and I think that's really important. So thank you. My question's actually about the zine form, and I'm kind of interested to hear what you think about like zines as a method of engaging with place, and like what's sort of unique about that form as a way of engaging with place. And part of me sort of wonders if it's to do with that element of like contradiction that you mentioned, but maybe you want to expand on that a bit more.
Interesting. So yes, so as a reminder, so yeah, I can just grab one of these. Which one's got more pictures in it? There we go. So that was number 3. So yeah, so these are the zines, the specific kind of physical things that I made to do that. I think I'm kind of a little ambivalent about whether it's a good tool or a better tool to engage with place than anything else, because every tool has a particular way of doing things. I mean, whether like video, sound, all that kind of stuff. But in terms of the process of going on a particular kind of journey, it does shape that, because I was basically able to, so when I started the first one, this is something I'm very used to anyway, but when I started the first one, I didn't have a clue really what I was doing. I mean, like, I knew what I was doing in the sense that I've been making zines and books for a long time, but like, I didn't know what the story was going to be. I didn't know what I was actually doing. I just knew that I wanted to tell the story about that. And it enabled me a place to experiment, because it wasn't being constrained by the market of somebody saying, yeah, you know, I'm not sure whether we'll publish that and all that kind of stuff. It was my voice and my experiment, like I said at the beginning, a kind of force of will to kind of just like, no, I just want to make this thing and see what it is. So it gives you a space to experiment, and it gives you a space to kind of try out and think and explore. And as I said, that sense of the process, I think. So it was the right tool for me. It doesn't mean it's the right tool for everybody else, but it did enable kind of an interrogation and experimentation. And one of the things about having been doing zines for nearly 18 odd years is that there's a certain amount of growing up in public that you do, because you make something, you print it out, you give it out, you sell it or whatever, and then before anyone can say anything bad about it, you make it your next one. And so you're kind of constantly learning and evolving, and you're not getting too no, I still get really precious about them, so it's not that. You still have a kind of sense of kind of connectedness. And what I like about them as a currency, though, and this also kind of helps with this, is that I've got friends all over the world just because I happen to print something out on my printer at home and fold it and staple it and then put it on the internet to sell or go to places to sell. Because those people do the same thing. And so you create these relationships and networks and conversations and dialogues, basically, and that helps shape the work. So it's like, it's a practice and it's a way of, for me, it's a way of being as much as it is a format. So whether it helps you interrogate a particular theme, I don't know, but it is my way of making sense of my world. And even though I got this one was published by a publisher called Little Toller, even though I've, got a book published, I'm in the big leagues now, I'm still always going to want to self-publish because it's the kind of root of who I am. So I don't know if that answers your question, slightly peregrinatory thing, because often people actually also, so as an academic with my other hat on, we often talk about like, ways to engage people with research. We'll make a zine about our research. And that's fine. I mean, it's just a form of publication. It's a way of putting together something in that. And but the thing for me that it's easier sometimes to talk about what a zine isn't than what it is, because for me, what it isn't is not just a commercial output. It's not just a pamphlet that you printed off. It's kind of got something in the way that you make it and the way that you do it that kind of is what, if you want to put a definition on it, is that kind of stuff. But that is another conversation.
Thank you.
All right, I think we've got one last one from Dave. Take us home.
Hi, thanks, Simon. I really enjoyed that. Found it really stimulating.
Thank you.
I don't know. I might have a question somewhere, but I have some thoughts.
Cool.
I think I have a question. First of all, what it's saying about the three-pronged forks?
The three-forked pole.
Three-forked pole.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm a social anthropologist working in New Zealand amongst Maori.
Yeah.
And there, traditionally, there was a similar mechanism for marking place, home. There were two versions. There was a tree or a pole. There's been some interesting research written about that, in which those born of the land would insert their pito, the skin that breaks off from the umbilical cord, and implant it into the tree to keep them rooted to the land. But there's also there was also the expectation that you lit a fire on lands, on communal lands. Yeah. You lit a fire, and it was your residence as long as you kept that fire burning. And so those people were called the ahika, those who kept the home fires burning. Right? So this has me thinking about stasis. Home suggests stasis. But I'm also interested by the fact that your father worked in radar, which is about tracking movement. Yeah. And from your biography, there's a lot of movement. So I wonder if, firstly, you could be thinking about homes rather than homes singular, homes plural, and also if any of your work does engage with your movement and the process of movement from place to place to place to place, the kind of thing that your father would have charted had you appeared on a chart.
I love that. That's an amazing question. Well, yeah. So very quickly for the three-fork pole thing, what I've always been really interested in, and that I started really experimenting with this book, is kind of like non-causal relationships. So basically going, if I can see a link between A and B, it's enough to write about A and B. So I write about like a band that my dad liked, that had a record of Principal Edward's Magic Theatre, because they were in Exeter and I was in Exeter, and then there's a tree, and all this kind of stuff. And so I'm really interested in kind of spinning those out, because I think those are ways of kind of connecting global stories, particularly where stories are yours to tell. So that sense of thinking about resonances with other kind of cultural practices is really, really interesting to me as well, but without kind of laying a causal link between the two. So, the three-fork pole and the things that you describe, the Maori culture is not necessarily, they don't have a relationship in that sense, but they kind of speak to a particular kind of way of doing things. So it'd be really interesting to kind of spin out again from that kind of stuff. Movement, no, I don't think I ever have. I think maybe a lot of my work has been about documenting and finding a sense of kind of place and moments of stillness or moments of disruption or whatever in my day-to-day life, which is really interesting thinking about it, because it's not, I've never really documented movement. No, it's always been like, yeah. So something like this, which is, so I have a regular series called Minor Leagues, which I've been doing since 2016. I've just finished issue 13, is at the printers, this is issue 12. And it's, you know, you can kind of probably see short bits of text, letters page, images, that kind of stuff. But it tends to document things like, I mean, going on holiday, so there's a bit of road trip stuff in there. There's, you know, trying to come to terms with particular kinds of things in the world, being miserable on the way home from a bus. So it's always about like the kind of the moments, the little moments of life that you reflect upon that make the quotidian kind of magical and sparkly. Like that kind of stuff is what I really am interested in. But it is really interesting to think about how that is kind of so much about the here and the now and not necessarily about the act of motion. So maybe there's something in there that can be teased out. That's a really good question, thank you. Yeah.
All right, I think that's probably all we got time for. So can everyone join me in saying thank you to Simon?
Thank you, everyone.
All right, before you all jet off, if you're here in the space with us today, in about half an hour, some of our work experience students are going to be sharing what they've been working on. So from 2:30 till 3:30 today, they'll be sharing some robotics projects that they've developed this week. They'll be scattered around the studio. Please come and give them some support, ask them some interesting questions. Also, please don't forget today is First Friday, so our monthly social event. So from 5 till 7 p.m. today, you can come along to the studio, grab a drink, and explore some of the work that our community is making. We've got your whole afternoon planned out for you. If you do want to stick around in Hot Desk today or find out more about what we do, then please come find one of the studio team and we'll be happy to help. Studio team, give us a wave. Here we are. There's more people around somewhere. If you're watching online, drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions. Thank you all for being here today, and we'll see you all again next time.
Thanks, everyone.